Hi everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to We Need to Talk About Nuclear Technology, an event presented by UNSW Engineering as part of the Engineering the Future 2022 series. My name is Lyria Bennett Moses and I am the Director of the UNSW Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. In making that acknowledgement, it is important to highlight history that includes nuclear testing, uranium mining, and nuclear waste proposals impacting Indigenous land. Nuclear is always a controversial subject, but I hope we can bear in mind that benefits and harms are rarely evenly distributed. Tonight's panel discussion is a space for the exchange of ideas to ignite long-term discussions of nuclear technology. The university is a broad place of different ideas, and the views expressed at this event may not necessarily be those of UNSW as an organisation. Now, when thinking about the name for this event, it struck me that we need to talk about nuclear points delightfully in both directions. Some people are keen to have a conversation in order to promote the opportunities that follow the AUKUS agreement or want to consider nuclear energy as a response to climate change. For others, the topic might be more analogous to we need to talk about Kevin. But whether you start from either of those standpoints, I hope that our discussion deepens your understanding and broadens your perspective. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Stephen Foster, Dean of UNSW Engineering, to give an address.
Thank you very much. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the land on which we meet, of the Gadigal nation, of the Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Such an important topic, nuclear science and engineering, can be a difficult one for discussions as to bring forward certain connotations and associations around some of the worst aspects of the term nuclear. However, we're all beneficiaries of nuclear technologies. There will be many of us here, if not most, in fact, dare I say all, that will have had an X-ray of some kind for a fracture or to identify where fillings are needed or passing through an airport. Isotopes used for medicine and scientific purposes. Indeed, the X-ray CT scanners that I use to advance my science in the matter of things, to work in advanced concrete structures. There's so many countries that have long-standing nuclear programs in civil energy applications. France and much of Europe, US, Canada, Japan. Such technologies having delivered greenhouse gas-free emissions for decades. And indeed, Australia does maintain a civil nuclear industry through Unsw, albeit a small one. With the announcement of the AUKUS agreement, the time is right again to have these discussions and ask questions as to what level of nuclear industry we, Australia, need and should have. Of course, discussions around nuclear technologies can and are passionate affairs, but that does not make them any less important ones to have, and thus important in the context of a university and academic environment that values considered and respectful academic debate. UNSW Engineering, with the support of Unsw and the Tyree Foundation, set up some time ago the first master's program in nuclear engineering in Australia. And Ed tells me we have about 23 students in that program this year in civil nuclear engineering. And I'd like to acknowledge the strong support of the Tyree Foundation. And we have Peter and Tyree and Robbie Fennell with us here today. We'd also like to acknowledge the strong advocacy of your father, Sir William Tyree, in this area of nuclear engineering I do reiterate that the discussions this evening do not represent in any way an institutional view, but rather from a legitimate question to be asked and discussed and debated with a view to progressing such an academically and community important topic. I look forward to the discussions tonight. I look forward to learning new things as I do every day, and I welcome the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I get the panelists to introduce themselves, I just wanted to let you know how we're doing the Q&A. So there's going to be a Slido, and I think there's a slide that explains the Slido coming in a minute. Yes. Okay. So please put your questions there, and after the initial bit of the panel, we'll get to those, as many of those as we can. All right. So next, could I ask each of the panelists to very quickly introduce themselves, starting with you, Ed?
Sure, Lyria. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see such a room full of faces from up here. I'm Dr. Edward Obbard, and I'm the program coordinator of the UNSW Masters in Nuclear Engineering. I'm also a nuclear materials scientist, and I do research on nuclear materials. I'm also chairing a working group at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, tasked with looking at the relationship between nuclear energy and society, and trying to think of new ways to imagine and think about this and find ways forward for all different types of people. And so this evening is actually a part of this exciting work, and I'm really grateful that we're all here.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm Dr. Ben Hearn. I'm a senior consultant at Fraser Nash Consultancy. We are a UK and Australia-based systems engineering and technology company, and the nuclear sector is a mainstream part of Fraser Nash's working life and portfolio. Prior to joining Fraser Nash, I was best known as an outspoken Australian voice for the use of for the beneficial uses of nuclear technologies, which for me started in about 2010, particularly with a presentation which absolutely pointedly was all about the fact that I had changed my mind. And just went from there. So we can talk more about that. It's a real pleasure, and what a lovely full room. So thank you all for coming.
Hi everyone. I'm louder than you. My name is Matthew Kearns. I'm based in the School of Humanities and Languages in the Environment and Society group. So I'm a social scientist, and I primarily look in my research at the relationship between science and society, or the public understanding of science. That means I work on controversial technologies. Nothing controversial about nuclear, of course. It's totally fine. So I've done work on GMOs, a little bit of work on nuclear, nanotechnology is another area. My work on nuclear is actually based in another time, in another place. So in the United Kingdom, during the Blair government, if you can remember the Blair government. So that's a country that has nuclear power, and was looking at that stage to think through the renewal of its nuclear capability. So it employed a whole range of social scientists to think about the public conversation about nuclear in that country, which is, I guess, a kind of, in a funny kind of way, an introduction to what we're doing tonight.
Indeed. So we need to talk about nuclear. Running through the panel in the same order, what do you think is the most important thing we need to talk about?
I think, this is a pretty pro-nuclear crowd, isn't it? I mean, looking out there. Maybe I'm making an assumption there, but people who come to these events usually come to sort of hear stuff that they like to hear. But I think we do need to talk about the values and the sort of worldview that underpin a sort of nuclear. Oh no! That's exactly what I was going to say. Oh no! I'll say something else, Ben.
No, you keep going.
No, I'll say. I won't say much about values. Because Ben's going to talk about that. But I think the thing that really needs to be talked about in the nuclear industry, and the whole energy transition, is how on earth are we going to live after 2050, right? Because the whole energy, nuclear, renewable, sunshine debate is all about, my God, there's this race to 2050. Bam, 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 bam. and it's this like competition of the fastest until 2050. We have to realize that actually in 2051, we're going to wake up and think, oh God, like now we have to live here for the next 100 years. And I think that's really the problem that we should be talking about. And it involves nuclear technology, by the way.
Thank you. And a nice switch over so that Ben can have his point.
Values.
Values. So look, first of all, I love words. They're my favorite tool. So I just want to pick up on the first word of the sentence. We. Fraser-Nash talks about nuclear. We do. It's normal. We do it all day long. We have hundreds of people working in it. It's just technology. It's part of life. It's part of working life. And so Australia is interesting and a bit quaint in the way we're having this conversation when we're a UK-based business. So I'm just going to take the Fraser-Nash hat off a little and sort of talk more from the Australian citizen Ben Hurd point of view about that, and say I think we need to have a conversation about values. I think it's got to be driven by not by a question of what do we want, where the answer isn't I want nuclear technology. It's we need the deeper, more values-driven answers to those questions. One way of doing that, for example, would be if we were to engage in the first step of the IAEA milestones process, which does not require changing the prohibition on nuclear technologies to participate in that first step, which is all about a nation making an informed commitment to pursue the use of nuclear technology to generate electricity. I think that would be a decent vehicle for that, because it would actually make perhaps more of the people in this room, if I follow Ed's assumption, or more nuclear proponents, have to take stock and confront the fact, the implications of the commitment we would be making, which are substantial. And you've got to back that up with values. Why would we go to this much effort? And it is effort. Why would we spend this much time? And it will take time. Why will we go to all of this trouble to embed these technologies in our nation, part of our lifestyle? It's very easy to be pro-nuclear. I know from experience that the more I learn, I remain steadfastly so, with increasing respect for how much effort and work goes into making nuclear safe, reliable, affordable, dependable, etc. So I think the main thing that we need to talk about is values. Why would we want it? And if we can find commonality there, we can have a more productive conversation with those who perhaps don't feel that they do.
Thanks, Lyria. Thanks, everyone. We need to talk about nuclear. The way I'm talking about is, what do we? And have we been talking about nuclear? And can we talk about how we talk about nuclear? So these are the classic answers that a social scientist gives, are non-answers, right? So my job is to not provide answers. So one way of answering the question is we have as a nation been talking about nuclear for 7 years. We're a nation where we had a generation of returning scientists really propel the creation of the nuclear research capability. We talked about some of the legacies of that at UNSW and other institutions. So we have been talking about nuclear. We've been talking about it in ways that perhaps people in this room are unsatisfied with. But we have been talking about nuclear. Just we've been talking about it in particular kind of ways. So do we have to talk about nuclear today in 2022? Well, I think we do. In a sense, we need to reflect on what has actually changed. We have, as a nation, I think, taken a quite substantial step with the AUKUS arrangement. We spent most of our time debating what the French president thought of our former prime minister, without actually reflecting on the gravity of that decision. So we have, for generations, elected not to pursue a certain set of military technologies, and that seemingly has changed. So this is a moment, I think, of quite profound deliberation that's required as a nation. It also matters who gets to speak. So as Lyria mentioned before, we are a nation with a unique and perhaps uncomfortable past of nuclear testing and weapons testing that has pretty profound and ongoing implications, particularly for First Nations peoples. So it matters who speaks, it matters who's in the room and who gets to be part of that conversation. So I think for in many ways, the invitation to a conversation is often the invitation to something that is already understood to be a form of advocacy. So if we were to have a conversation, that conversation needs to be an open one, where in fact there are lots of possible endpoints to that discussion. That's what I guess I'd say.
Okay, I'm going to go back to you, Matt, because you mentioned the AUKUS decision and the important part, as opposed to the opinion of the French about Morrison. How significant was that decision to decide to invest in nuclear submarines?
Thanks, Lyria. I'm not a military strategist or a technology procurist, but just from a casual observation, this is a really profound kind of shift in emphasis for Australia. And we're at a really particularly interesting moment in nuclear matters in Australia. So we have an agreement around AUKUS. We also have the current government making particular moves around non-proliferation. At the same time, there's a rumbling conversation around civil nuclear power. This is a really complex and uncertain dynamic for conversations around nuclear. So the question, I think, for people that are interested in propelling a conversation around nuclear is can you have a conversation around nuclear expertise, nuclear technology, nuclear capability, the kind of decisions that we're likely to need around, say, siting the military facility or the maintenance and repair of those craft, whilst not also seeing this as a proxy for advocacy for other technologies, such as civil nuclear power. Is that possible? Is that desirable? Is that something that we're capable of in public life? I guess that's the questions I'd like to see.
Ben, do you have any answers to that?
Yeah, I do. How significant was that? The root of the question.
Well, how significant was the decision to invest in nuclear submarines, but also some of Matt's questions at the end there?
Hugely significant, to an extent that I don't think Australians yet have embedded. I take some heart from the non-conversation that was had about the technology choice, because I feel that Australians at large kind of did say, job to do, fit for purpose technology. I find that a bit hard to argue with. I think that's good. I get that. But the significance should not be understated. So supporting the nuclear propelled submarine fleet of the United Kingdom is a place you will find many Fraser-Nash employees. And this is a sizable undertaking. It is breaching no confidential information to point out that Australia's current nuclear capability is, I guess, centred around a 20 megawatt thermal stationary light reactor, proudly called the open pool. It has no lid, making medicine. This is a move to become custodians of 8 or more 200 megawatt thermal light water reactors running on highly enriched uranium. This is not an incremental change. This is a wholly transformational change and uplifting capability. So I don't think the significance of that is yet broadly grasped. It hasn't been done before in this order of technology acquisition. And so there is, I think there was, and the point that Matt has made is also extremely, extremely important. It also cannot and should not be used as a football for a broader conversation about the broader uses of nuclear power. That capability is vitally important in its own right, standalone, and bipartisanship is essential. So how do you possibly square that circle where a very intelligent answer was given earlier today that this will be an accelerant? It can't not be. This level of investment, of transformation, of learning, of understanding can only serve to accelerate this conversation. And yet at the same time, it must be treated with the utmost care, that it is not leveraged in crass ways that could put that at risk. That is going to be a really complicated conversation to have going forward, that's going to demand considerable professionalism from top to bottom of that conversation.
And I might go to you on something slightly different, which is, I suppose, this question about how linked all these conversations are. So can we do that separation? Can we separate, the different species of nuclear technology and have conversations about each without stumbling over the others? So nuclear medicine, nuclear supply chain, nuclear submarines, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. Are they sort of distinct areas that one can address separately?
Yes. Yes. is that what? Yeah. Look, they really are. I mean, but the devil is in the details, isn't it? It really is. Like, you first of all have to absolutely overcome the idea that everything nuclear is kind of the same, because it really isn't. But then in some of those categories you just mentioned, there is a lot of crossover. Like Ben was saying, I mean, in terms of the national capability and the skills and the training, like 8 200 megawatt PWRs cruising around in the ocean really does help you to run small modular reactors on land. Like, I cannot really disconnect those. It doesn't mean that you will or that you have to, but training something like 10,000 engineers to run a military submarine nuclear program means there's going to be a lot of people around who understand nuclear technology. It also means there's going to be a much, much heightened awareness in government and policy circles of how nuclear technology actually works. And if it turns out that in the future we have another very important job for nuclear reactors to do, I cannot deny that we will be in a much better position to use that nuclear technology. Because look, it's all about the pressurized water reactor, which is a kind of technology. We've just had a meeting this afternoon talking about pressurized water reactors and how to train people to understand them, be able to use them, and even manufacture parts of them. Another thing you mentioned was nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons are really, really different to pressurized water reactors. There's like a whole completely different set of national infrastructure, very, very large national infrastructure, very, very expensive national infrastructure, which is just not connected to running pressurized water reactors in submarines or otherwise. So for me, I mean, based on my knowledge, it's almost inconceivable that you would, I mean, it's not inconceivable, it's just silly, right? That you would start out by building nuclear submarines and go, oh, whoops, I find myself building nuclear weapons. It's just silly, like really is. Notwithstanding the fact they both begin with nuclear. And that's the whole thing about nuclear safeguards, right? Is it's well known that to make sufficient quantities of fissile material for a weapon, you need this like national scale infrastructure, which is completely impossible to create under safeguards and in a clandestine way. So really the only way that countries actually go for nuclear weapons is by making a very, very clear decision right from the start that that's what they want, right? You can't stumble into that.
No, fair enough. Matt, the social science perspective, that's sort of a technical answer, right?
Yeah.
Like these are the technologies that are grouped and this one's over here. The social science perspective, though, and thinking more about how the public would understand it.
Sure. Look, I mean, I think what we've been chatting about a little bit is this question of values. And so technology systems manifest values. They just make sometimes those value commitments tacit and sort of, in a sense, obscure. One of the things about nuclear technologies is they typically manifest values of secrecy, and because they are associated with the military. And so we like to keep our military technologies to some degree secret from prying eyes, right? That does not make necessarily for the most open, democratic, accountable discussion about our nuclear future. The kind of thing we are inviting ourselves to think about this evening. We are saying we need to talk. I'm not sure the military thinks we need to talk about nuclear. They would, I think, prefer us not to be talking about nuclear. So we are, in a funny kind of way, talking about different things at the same time. Thinking about Australia's own nuclear history and its continuing legacies, we are in fact still telling the histories of the nuclear weapons tests in Maralinga and Emu fields. And these were consistently obscured, made secret from the people they affected the most. That's a problem. That's our history. Now we need to own up to that, and we need to have a very honest conversation about this pattern of state secrecy in relation to nuclear. My worry is that if this is led by discussion about military capabilities, that will, in a sense, shape the nature of the discussion we perhaps want to have.
Okay, and that brings us back to values. And Ben, I'll start with you on this one, given you, well, I don't know who raised values first, but I think you were allowed to. So what values and what economic, environmental, legal or technological issues should underlie policy going forward?
If there was an umbrella answer to that, I would say longer term values are very, very, very important in all of this. The whole equipment of a nuclear industry for civilian or for defence purposes is not an electoral cycle timeframe issue at all. And so we do need to have, in my opinion, you've named sort of several areas, a broad conversation about that is long in time. I am regularly frustrated by fellow travellers in nuclear advocacy seeking to drive the passion and the commitment and the wish for nuclear deeper and deeper and deeper. I'm going, no, it needs to be broader and broader and broader. We do not need everyone to be as into it as me. God forbid, right? But we do need a broadly based values understanding of that. So interesting conversations I've had with Stephen Wilson from University of Queensland recently about people from my lens were taking a very strongly climate changed values focus to this decarbonisation, deep decarbonisation, beyond electricity, heat, fuels, very, very important. Also jobs and skills and generational jobs, unionised, high quality, high paid, reliable jobs that you can have a house and a family and live in a town and know they're going to be there type jobs, good jobs. Lee Phillips, journalist, author, UK, has said one of the most salient things about this, which is that the right of politics appears, when it comes to climate change, the right of politics appears to have the right technologies and the wrong politics. And the left of politics appears to have the right politics with the wrong technologies. Nuclear is an inherently socialist technology. It requires the state. It requires planning. It requires timeframes. It requires commitments to longer term stuff. It is an intentional technology pathway. So I would be thinking broad and long, not that necessarily that deep, would be the values conversation that should be held on nuclear. That I think today, I don't know, ask me tomorrow. I've been doing this for 10 years. It's hard. That today I think would be the most productive type of conversation to have.
Matt, I might let you take that one on next.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really important conversation. And of course I was going to say that. I'm a social scientist, so I'm arguing for my own job, right? But one of the experiences that's been most chastening in my academic career has been talking to engineers that front up to public meetings about a controversial technology or some such, right? And what tends to happen in those meetings is people immediately Google the speaker to try to figure out who are they being paid by. Yeah. Are they an honest broker in this discussion? Are they likely to benefit from this, that, or the other technology? What that tells you is we live in an increasingly kind of polarized time, and at a time at which trust in institutions that were once deemed to be trustworthy is continually being kind of critiqued. It's subject to question. This is we're used to this in all manner of kind of experiences in social life, right? So we might wish that's not the case, but it is the case, right? So what we need in this discussion are forms of honest brokering. Then I'm not sure that's you, I'm afraid, because I think this bears on the question of universities. And in conversations about nuclear power and nuclear technologies and other controversial technologies, what tends to happen is a blurring between the forms of expertise that are necessary to manage those technologies and advocacy for particular kinds of technology. So advocates are great, but they're not the only voice we need in this discussion. The other thing which I'd say here is that the very last thing I would do is have a conversation about a technology. So all of the work that I do tends to point towards the thing you do first is have a conversation about the problem. What is the problem that you are thinking about collectively? The technologies come last. The technologies are the very last thing you want to talk about. So I've done a lot of work in this space. The results of 25 years of collective social science is that you want to generate public discussion about the context of use rather than promote a message about how safe a technology is. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of public discussions about technology because it assumes that publics are engaged in a risk-benefit calculation. That's not what the research shows. So we need to actually change the nature of the conversation we wish to have with the broader public.
Can I have a right to reply on that one?
Very quickly.
Sure. Matt, I was told that I was paid for the nuclear industry when I was running my own small business as a consultant. Sure. I was told I was paid by the nuclear industry when I was on a PhD scholarship and raising 2 young children. Mm-hmm. I've been told that I was paid by the nuclear industry forever. It's probably been quietest since I probably maybe now am in a sense. I mean, I'm not. I'm paid by Fraser Nash Consultancy. We do lots of stuff. But I think now the fact that maybe some of those people are frightened they might get properly sued for trash talking me too badly, it seems to have quietened down a little bit. So I reject the contention that anything should happen where truthful, genuine expertise is not presented because of a concern of vexatious activity to undermine the voice. Just recently, in doing a multi-author peer review paper, I have had highly credentialed, credible people contacting the lead authors on the paper, sending them links to a trash talk page all about me, maintained by a lifelong committed anti-nuclear activist. So, no, voices are deemed credible largely by the people standing around them, saying that they are credible. So if people walk away from people like me, we end up with a trend of anti-expertise, which is deeply dangerous, and universities can't do everything. So I do not accept that contention.
That's fine, but what I'm not saying is that we need to pay attention to vexatious claim. But what I am saying is there is a pattern in the way we have these conversations in public, and there is a demonstrable pattern. And we are living through a period where forms of expertise are the subject of increasing scrutiny, whether we like it or not. And so rather than just bemoan that fact, we actually need to do something a bit different. So rather than have a technology push discussion, I think we need a discussion which is framed by the nature of the problem to which that technology is addressed. That's a very different conversation.
Okay, I'm going to give you guys a chance right at the end to say something else. But Ed, your answer, and in case it's a bit distant, the question is not who's allowed to speak. The question is, what values and what economic, environmental, legal and technological issues should underlie policy going forward?
Well, look, I'm not really going to answer the question. But I do want to kind of answer it with another question. I'm always really curious, actually, and I think Matthew and Ben have kind of dug this up, about what the values of people who support nuclear technology are that make them think that it's good. Because if you were to look at a sort of heuristic decision kind of basis about, nuclear technology and radiation, we should all loathe it. I mean, we should all be absolutely terrified, because radiation, we know, presses all the buttons for something which we dread and which we fear. The risk of significant unlikely accidents presses all the wrong buttons in terms of how we perceive risk. We know that. We know it. It's very, very hard to like. So I always wonder, because I hang around with sort of pro-nuclear people a lot, what makes us tick? What actually makes us think, well, hang on a minute, yeah, this is really good. Let's give it a try. and I have been thinking about what those values might be, and it's part of this sort of nuclear energy agency work that I mentioned at the beginning. Is we've decided that trying to define these values may be some way to find common ground, because everybody has values, right? That's something we can talk about. So I think there is probably a set of values that lead people to highly rate, say, nuclear fission reactors, and to think that it's worth a punt, or something that it's important, that it somehow matters. I mean, so I'll give it a shot, right? I think one is that we really, really value scientific decision making. We have this sort of hierarchy of importance, which has been beautifully expressed by, the famous Hyman Rickover when he said, the ultimate law is the law of nature and physics, right? You cannot disobey that. Below the law of nature and physics, you have the laws of the country in which you live. And below that is the laws of, not even law, like the rules of the organizations in which you work. Because Rickover was a pretty polarizing character. He just ignored, basically, the rules in the organizations in which he worked. And so you can see with a worldview like that, what you actually place down the bottom is what people think, right? Which is, it starts out by feeling, wonderful. I'm a scientist, I place science as the highest law of the land. But you end up with something which may be slightly problematic, is that if you kind of rank your belief system like that, you end up with probably disregarding the views of people. And then it makes you think, well, actually, why are we even doing this? We're following this technology to improve the lives of people. So whenever you start talking about values like this, you do kind of end up with a double-edged sword. Because I go back again, I am a scientist. I do think that belief and understanding and faith almost in science is important, right? We keep on telling each other to follow the science. Values of nuclear. Ben, what are your values that make you like nuclear technology?
So for example, I've already automatically internalized the long-termism. So Ed's right. Used nuclear fuel's really, really hazardous. It's deadly, right? Out of the reactor, if you're too close to it, you are dead, right? We know how to manage it. That's true and different, but it is deadly. And it is a challenge to be managed for the long term. So I've made some decisions about long-termism and our ability to have institutional management of such things that I believe in, that I believe are right. Some American friends of mine, Susie Baker and Jessica Lovering, have, similar to what you've been describing, had talked about risk and how people relate to risk to try to get to the bottom of why people relate so differently to things like nuclear power. And what they premised, and I think this is powerful, is that, and I think it really goes to some of what Matt's been talking about, if you are generally a person who feels that you have pretty high levels of agency in your life and are pretty resilient to something maybe happening and going on, then you are more likely to be positively disposed to a thing like nuclear, where you are told that people are in charge and that it is being managed and that it is being managed well. Right? You're not in charge, but you are understanding that people are. Something might happen, but if it happens, my general sense of in the world is that I'm pretty resilient to stuff. Now, their premise is that in the American context, that largely describes the middle-aged white man. That's me, right? So I'm not a primary carer. I was actually, but that's just me because I'm awesome, right? But you know, the stereotypical, right? Not a primary carer, probably not caring for children, probably not caring for aged parents, probably on a reasonably high income, probably has decent healthcare, is probably empowered in all of these ways, feels less of a victim or less likely to be a victim of other people's misdeeds. And when you've mentioned that the risks and the benefits are not evenly distributed, well, what if you reverse all of that? You know, what if you're a less empowered social class in the United States with less agency and less, you feel more threatened by other people doing the wrong thing with less ability to deal with it. You will approach the question of nuclear risk very differently. And we've got to be more honest about that.
I'm going to come in and say just one thing, and I want to pick up, Ed, on one of the points you made, because I quite like this idea, right? So you have the laws of science, if you like.
It's legal, isn't it?
Well, I can't help get excited, right? But you've got the laws of science, if you like, and that is one kind of possible, right? Like, so if something, you know, you can't, falling up, you know, a heavy object by itself without some kind of power is not possible, right? There's laws of physics and so forth. And that's sort of one constraint on what's possible. That's why we're probably talking about nuclear fission and not nuclear fusion, you know, because we can do one and not the other, right? So, or at least, you know, that I've read. All right, maybe we can do both and your students will be able to do that for us. But there's a set of what you can do. Then there's a set of what the laws of the land are, right? So we get to make laws that set up what's possible. So, you know, even if it were possible to build a nuclear fusion reactor, I'm pretty sure there's a law somewhere that says I can't do it in my backyard, right? Almost certainly.
It's a nuclear installation.
Yeah. I'm sure someone would come after me, right? So we get to create the rules, and those rules set, you know, what exists and what doesn't exist, what kinds of nuclear technology are permitted and what isn't permitted. But there's a lot more nuanced potential than that, right? We can also set up the terms of how. We can set it up so we don't have to trust the leader at the top of an organization, for example, because we have safety inspectors, right, who would come in on some sort of regular basis and do certain kinds of tests so that the public can be assured that it is safe. Is that perfect? No, because you then got to trust the safety inspectors. But you can create layers of these things to provide the kind of assurances we might want for the technologies we have. And it's not just for safety. We can do it for how things are used in other ways as well, right? We can set all sorts of other kinds of constraints around it. So we have the power, if we get the values right, to decide what is in, what is out, but also how what is in is done.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And the transparency is vital in the how of the implementation of that. To what extent can people be participants in the experience and feel that they get some agency in how those things are being managed is extraordinarily important.
Okay. I can see you want to say something about, but I want to move on to audience questions. So if it's short and quick, you can go.
I do. So what often happens in these sort of discussions, and just to pick on you a little bit, we quickly move into a fact-value distinction. We assume, you said, my values are that I love science. Well, of course you do. I love science too, so does everybody. And that's not unique to one side of a debate or other. But often these debates are based on the assumption that we have the facts and our opponents have the values. What we need to acknowledge is that values are on both sides, right?
I think that's my point.
Yeah, but generally speaking, these debates are often framed by we are the force of science, and over here is the force of irrationality and et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to really question that in quite substantial terms.
I mean, that's exactly what I'm questioning. Yeah.
Okay, good. We agree. I'm going to move to audience questions because we're in our last 5 minutes. So first up, we have a question from Tim Boyle. So what does the panel think about the geopolitical implications of Australia developing nuclear capability within its defence sector? Is it a net positive? Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll go first. Is it a net positive for who? Really, really difficult question. Is it a necessary, sensible way for Australia to have a capability, which we weren't arguing that we needed a submarine capability. That wasn't actually in question. Now we're talking about having a vastly better one. So I would say that's a positive for Australia's defence. The need to establish a repeatable defensible, well-justified structure for the Non-Proliferation Treaty to endure and continue to be respected, such that this transfer of materials technology isn't used for the wrong purposes. That's a big challenge. That's really, really important to get right. In many wise people are saying, we're not saying we expect Australia to develop nuclear weapons here. That's not what we're saying. We're saying we are concerned about anything that becomes a repeatable process that might lead to other parties having greater access with a less strong, and we should say Australia's record is impeccable as far as non-proliferation and safeguards go. So really, basically number one. So good, but that's the repeatability of that is a genuine challenge. It is another one of those bits of, what's the significance of this? It's really significant.
What about the submarines not being able to go to New Zealand?
Well, let's respect that choice of New Zealand's, of course, but it's interesting. I think that's regrettable, but that is a decision for New Zealand.
Matt?
So I am not in any sense skilled in talking about security matters at all, except to say it strikes me that there are two things we might want to think about: the fall of Singapore in the Second World War and the Trump presidency. So we are, in a sense, living through a time when our strategic ally or allies appear to be less reliable than perhaps they might have done 10, 15 years ago. If that is the case, and if that is one of the considerations for this move by the Australian government, we should have that conversation in a much more substantial manner. If in a sense, the Trump presidency told us that we can't rely on our US ally to be the hegemon in the Asia Pacific region, that's a really profound change in our circumstance that we should talk about a lot more.
Okay, next question. Why should Australia consider nuclear power when the development horizon is 10 to 15 years for it to be competitive and we already have the technology for solar?
Oh, I mean, I answered that with the first thing I said, is that I think that decarbonisation doesn't end in 2050. In fact, it's only the beginning. And all of the solar and wind infrastructure that we are now installing is all going to be in landfill by 2050, and we'll still have to figure out how to live.
Yeah, broadly speaking, I'd reject the premise of that question, if I may. There is no way known that Australia or the world is going to be at a problem-solved situation in a particular deadline, be it 10 or 15 years. South Australia installed its first wind turbine 2003. We sort of had I am South Australian. We had the biggest, the largest, the fastest wind industry. Here we are. It's 20 years later. Do we have a wind industry? Yes. Have we solved all that problem? No. In fact, we created some more. These time horizons are always long. We've inherited that narrative for several successive rounds of this conversation. This will take a long time. So I've been hearing it will take 20 years for 20 years. This is a much longer conversation. It doesn't end in 2050. We need to decarbonise industrial heat. We need to decarbonise transport. We need to undertake the most phenomenal quantity of real-time chemistry to remove fossil oil from the economy. The amount of hydrogen and ammonia that we are going to need to make daily, yearly, monthly, forever is enormous. And we are really only just scraping across the top of our current electrical grid right now, let alone electric vehicles, let alone all of those synthetic fuels, let alone all of that industrial heat, let alone the power to drive direct air capture and storage to actually reduce, from 422 parts per million CO2 that we are today back to something later. The amount of power we're going to need is extraordinary. So we need all of our technology tools in front of us.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question, but it's a yes/no one. So I'm just going to ask you to raise your hands if you agree with Chris Skinner. Does the panel agree the two main objections to nuclear are sustainable disposal of radioactive waste and, secondly, the risk of a nuclear accident? If you agree, put your hand up.
I don't agree.
Okay, no, no.
So sometimes don't give straight answers.
Don't give straight answers. I can't even agree with the premise of the question. All right. That's, I think,
Cost. It's moved on to cost.
that is, I think, all we have time for. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for that discussion. As I said at the outset, I think it was good to get... Oh,
I think Ben would like to say a little thank you.
of course, please.
First of all, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for renewing the Tyree Foundation's commitment to support this discussion, this conversation, this debate on should nuclear energy be or not be in Australia. So thank you all for coming, and it is a great panel, and you've helped, I think, the Tyree organisation through this. To guide this conversation and debate is so important, and I think you touched on setting a goal. What is our collective goal? And I think that in that last comment about that Chris Skinner brought up, highlights misinformation, which is irrelevant maybe at this point, because why would we do this? Have we set a goal, our collective goal, that clean, cheap energy to deliver the most stable electricity power grids is what we're trying to achieve? And I think that's come out fabulously from what you've said. So the last little comment is, are SMRs, because you brought up the topic of cost right at the end, are SMRs the better answer as we go by time, and why? We've seen so many nuclear countries generate electricity for so many years. Is the next evolution, just like we don't have the Wright brothers aeroplane flying today, we have fast jets that are safe, the safest form of travel that's evolved from maybe the most dangerous source of travel. And the belief of evolution of what engineers do is a way, I think, to help us. Thank you all so much. It's really helped me, and I speak on behalf of the Tyree Foundation, to continue to support our funding of this course. Thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you for those words and the questions that they leave everybody with, on top of the questions that I think we still are left with. So I hope that you all can join us for refreshments and stay and continue chatting. And we'll at least, we won't get answers, maybe. Certainly the social scientists won't. But we'll at least feel like we've had a good go at it. Thank you, everybody.